companies, contractors who are employing their employees through shell companies. For example, KBR has employed many of its employees through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, which means that the company and the employees don't have to pay Medicare and Social Security insurance. And so what you have there is a situation where the U.S. government is giving money in the form of a contract to a company that is, on the other hand, undermining the viability of the Social Security and Medicare system. KBR therefore gets an advantage in bidding because it can undercut those competitors who are paying insurance for their employees. So it is a double whammy.
First, you have to hold contractors accountable. That can be difficult to do if they're in the private sector and their personnel are coming and going. And secondly, there's a problem of essentially the strategy. What are you really trying to build here? Are you trying to build profits for corporations that are domiciled outside the country, or are you building permanent national institutions inside Afghanistan that can gradually take control of the country and reduce the need for Western partnership?
How much are you and every American paying for the wars after taking into account so-called hidden costs like taking care of wounded soldiers?
Veterans, when they come back, are entitled to health care for a number of years that is free, provided by the VA. They're also, if they have a disability, which a very large percentage of them do, are entitled to disability compensation for the rest of their lives. These things are very significant long-term costs. And then there are also what we call social costs. In other words, these are costs that they are real and somebody pays them, but the government doesn't pay them. For example, if a veteran comes home wounded and his spouse or parent has to quit their job to become a full-time caretaker, and in 20% of cases this is what happens. If that happens, I mean, that person is giving up an income. You know, that is a loss to the economy and to the person. That is a social cost.
The indirect costs, for example, having to deal with people that are wounded, people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, for people who will require care from the Veterans Administration. If you continue on this current pace, what you're talking about is a war that will cost, by the end of this decade, close to $1 trillion when you count all of the costs.
The Afghan government budget, salaries for government officials, is about $1.2 billion a year. When you hire, 150,000 police officers, which is, what Obama would like to see, you have to pay that salaries. And the bulk of those salaries today are paid by the US government. So you really have a problem in the sense that Afghanistan is so desperately poor, and the fact that all the money for local police officers to government ministries such as the women's ministries come from outside, it is simply not sustainable.
What we've shown the world is that a sole superpower without any opponent in sight can spend, I believe now we're approaching $800 billion. Long-term costs may be more in the vicinity of $3 trillion, that we can lose 5,000 Americans, that we see another 30,000 injured. And this tremendous expenditure cannot stabilize two countries who together comprise about 1% of the world population.
You can't fight a war and finance it the way we have without it having an impact on the economy.
Common expression these days, doomsday budget.
We basically took all this money out of the U.S. economy, put it into spending which had which had no benefit at all for the U.S. economy, and added all of this debt, so we weakened our economy.
Well, millions of homeowners faced foreclosure last year, and many more still stand to lose their homes.
The housing market collapse created one financial crisis after another, and it often seemed as if the news could only get worse.
You can make an analogy, I believe, to the housing bubble and the Wall Street bubble and the bank bubble. in the sense that there's no adult supervision. That's a lot of the fundamental problem that got us into trouble on housing, banks, and Wall Street.
Congressional aides say President Barack Obama is now seeking $83.4 billion to fund the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan into the fall.
More than $185 billion.
$775,000 a year to put a soldier or Marine into the war.
Close to $1 trillion when you count all of the costs.
So perhaps we can look at the cost of the U.S. war in Afghanistan around the country. We'll start in the South, in Alabama. That state will pay through fiscal year 2009 $1,695 million for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. All of these people in Alabama, plus 200,000 more, could have full health care coverage for 1 year for what Alabama will pay for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. In New York, it will pay through fiscal year 2009 nearly $17 billion for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. That's equal roughly to, another figure, nearly 2 million Head Start places. We can get to Arizona, that will pay $2.5 billion for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. 20% of Arizona residents are not covered by health care, and half could be if these federal tax dollars were allocated differently.
I think the real key is going to be letting the American people know the full cost and the duration of the conflict. Because if the American people are not willing to support this war, it cannot be waged and accomplished successfully.